In the early decades of the first century, the region of Judea existed under the administrative oversight of the Roman Empire. Following the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC, governance was divided among his sons, and by the early 30s AD, Pontius Pilate administered Judea as prefect under the authority of Emperor Tiberius. The province was characterized by a complex interaction of Roman authority, local Jewish governance through the Sanhedrin, and diverse sectarian movements within Judaism, including Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Within this context, a Galilean Jew named Jesus emerged as a teacher and itinerant preacher. Documentation for this period is limited to sources written after the events, including the letters of Paul, particularly 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3-7, which references the death and posthumous appearances of Jesus, and Roman records contextualizing provincial governance and incidents of local unrest. Archaeological evidence from the region corroborates settlement patterns, trade routes, and urban centers, such as Sepphoris, Capernaum, and Jerusalem, indicating the geographic scope of Jesus' activities. Jesus' movement operated primarily within Jewish communities in Galilee and Judea. His activities involved itinerant teaching, engagement in synagogues, and gathering small groups of followers. Sources indicate that the followers maintained structured interactions, including instruction, communal meals, and itinerant accompaniment. Within the city of Jerusalem, the movement was most concentrated in the immediate aftermath of the crucifixion. The execution of Jesus is documented within multiple sources. Roman administrative records establish that capital punishment was under the authority of the Roman prefect. The gospel narratives, corroborated by early letters such as 1 Corinthians, record that Jesus was arrested, tried by Roman authorities, and executed by crucifixion, the standard method for non-citizens accused of sedition. Following the execution, the group that had accompanied Jesus in Jerusalem reorganized. Contemporary documentation is primarily preserved in Pauline letters, including 1 Corinthians, which indicates that the movement had already formed a network of believers who maintained communication regarding teachings and practices. These gatherings were structured, involving instruction in the Hebrew Scriptures and emerging interpretive frameworks concerning Jesus' role within Jewish traditions. Archaeological evidence from Jerusalem indicates that households could accommodate small assemblies, consistent with early Christian gatherings being domestic and localized. The earliest extant records indicate that women played documented roles in these gatherings. While the Gospel texts describe activities such as visits to the tomb, corroborated by Pauline letters, the historical record primarily confirms that women were active members of the Jerusalem community, participating in meals, instruction, and logistical support. The nascent Christian community also developed an organizational framework for communal maintenance. Documentation from early letters indicates oversight mechanisms and roles resembling leadership structures. The presence of designated figures such as James, referred to in Paul's letters and later in 1 Clement, suggests the establishment of authority within the Jerusalem community. The community distributed resources to support members who lacked means and maintained communication with believers in outlying regions of Judea. During this period, tensions with the Jewish authorities arose. Acts of internal community discipline and external opposition are documented in later writings, including references to the execution of deacons such as Stephen, reflecting friction between the emergent movement and the Sanhedrin. These records indicate that the community navigated both internal organization and external pressures without detailed accounts of individual motives, which remain undocumented. Evidence shows that these conflicts were limited to a few urban centers and were not indicative of broader regional disruption. By 33 AD, the community had established foundational practices that would persist throughout the first century. Gatherings were characterized by communal instruction, shared meals, and adherence to a set of interpretive traditions drawn from Hebrew scriptures. Letters circulated among adherents in nearby Judean towns and villages, forming the earliest verifiable network of communication. The community remained concentrated in Jerusalem, but maintained links to surrounding settlements in Judea, including Bethlehem, Emmaus, and rural Galilean towns, consistent with trade routes and population centers of the period. No independent Roman record references the internal theological interpretations of the movement at this time. What is documented is the presence of an identifiable group operating under Roman and Jewish jurisdiction, maintaining internal organization, and persisting despite the execution of its founder. The earliest surviving letters, particularly those of Paul, indicate recognition of the Jerusalem leadership and provide instructions regarding gatherings, conduct, and disputes among members, demonstrating continuity in practice. In terms of demographic composition, the movement initially consisted primarily of Jews from Galilee and Judea. Pauline letters and early post-apostolic texts reference both male and female participants, indicating a degree of inclusivity within the bounds of the society. Social roles and responsibilities were organized around household structures, as indicated by references to community support, leadership responsibilities, and gatherings in private residences. The geopolitical context influenced the movement's organization and mobility. Roman military and administrative presence in Jerusalem, including the garrison at Antonia Fortress and oversight from Pilate, created a structured environment that constrained public gatherings but allowed household assemblies. The community operated largely in private spaces while continuing public engagement through itinerant members and communication between urban centers. Following the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, the group of individuals associated with his teachings continued to assemble in Jerusalem. Contemporary documentation from Pauline letters, particularly 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3-7, provides evidence of the early organization of these followers. The letters indicate recognition of leadership structures, communication among communities, and shared practices, all of which establish the earliest historical evidence for the Jerusalem community. Archaeological surveys of Jerusalem from this period show domestic structures capable of hosting small assemblies, corroborating the textual evidence of gatherings in private residences. The Jerusalem community organized itself around a small group of leading figures. Historical references in Paul's letters and 1 Clement, written c. 96 AD, suggest that James, the brother of Jesus, held a central leadership role. Peter and John are also cited in early writings as individuals providing oversight, instruction, and coordination among assemblies. These figures functioned in capacities comparable to presiding elders, responsible for instruction, adjudication of disputes, and oversight of communal resources. The structure appears to have been fluid but maintained continuity in governance, allowing the community to endure despite external pressures. Communal practices included gatherings for instruction, reading of Hebrew scriptures, and organized meals. Pauline's correspondence indicates that members contributed to communal sustenance, suggesting that the community maintained economic and social support mechanisms for individuals without independent means. References in later texts, such as 1 Clement 46-49, confirm that these mechanisms included allocation of resources to widows, orphans, and other dependents, demonstrating a structured internal economy consistent with household-level gatherings. These practices indicate that the Jerusalem community operated with administrative and organizational foresight, enabling continuity and expansion. The composition of the early community was primarily Jewish, originating from Galilee, Judea, and surrounding regions. Evidence from the letters of Paul, which reference fellow Jews and Gentile associates, indicates that the Jerusalem community maintained interactions with other Jewish groups in Jerusalem, including Pharisaic and Sadducean authorities. This interaction led to tensions documented in later writings, including the execution of a community member, Stephen, identified in Acts 6-7, and referred to indirectly in subsequent correspondence. While the historical accuracy of individual trials is difficult to establish independently, the presence of opposition from Jewish authorities is corroborated by Roman administrative structures that documented incidents of local unrest and capital cases. The political environment in Jerusalem was dominated by Roman authority through Pontius Pilate and the local governance of the Sanhedrin. The presence of Roman troops, taxation policies, and oversight of legal proceedings influenced the operations of the community. Assemblies occurred primarily in domestic settings, enabling private congregation without immediate interference, while public activities were monitored due to the political sensitivity of gatherings perceived as sectarian or subversive. Roman and Jewish oversight constrained public actions but did not eliminate the continuity of meetings, as evidenced by subsequent communications preserved in letters. Communication among dispersed groups in Judea and Galilee was maintained through messengers and letters. Paul's later writings, while dated after 36 AD, reference prior instructions. The letters addressed matters such as dispute resolution, communal instruction, ethical guidance, and logistical organization, demonstrating that the community operated with a documented framework of internal governance. The earliest surviving letters, while primarily Pauline, reflect continuity of practice originating in the Jerusalem community, confirming that the group functioned as a coherent network rather than a loosely affiliated collection of individuals. Women are documented as active members of the Jerusalem community, while later texts, including gospel accounts, describe specific actions such as visits to the tomb, Pauline letters, and 1 Clement, confirm the participation of women in gatherings, instruction, and logistical support. Archaeological evidence, including domestic household structures with multiple rooms capable of hosting small assemblies, supports the notion that women participated in private and communal functions, including the preparation of resources and management of domestic venues for meetings. These roles indicate inclusivity within operational parameters while remaining consistent with Jewish social norms of the period. The period from 33 to 36 AD also records the dispersion of community members due to external pressures. Historical references from Acts and indirect attestations in letters indicate that individuals moved from Jerusalem to surrounding towns in Judea, including Bethlehem, Emmaus, and other Galilean settlements. This dispersal was partially a response to opposition from local authorities and partially due to the necessity of supporting a growing membership. Evidence from Paul's letters suggests that individuals traveling between communities carried instructions, collections, and reports, establishing the earliest known network of intercity communication for the community. Internal organization included the appointment of deacons to oversee specific tasks within the community. Acts 6 verses 1 to 6 references the selection of 7 individuals to manage distribution to widows and oversee charitable functions, reflecting the historical need for administrative roles to manage resources and reduce internal disputes. While the names of these individuals are preserved in later writings, their functions are independently verifiable in the context of organizational necessity. This evidence indicates that the Jerusalem community had established internal hierarchies designed to maintain social cohesion and operational continuity. Relations with the Sanhedrin and broader Jewish authorities influenced the community's activities. Historical sources indicate that disputes over adherence to Jewish law and authority structures contributed to limited confrontations. The execution of Stephen, noted in Acts and indirectly referenced in early letters, demonstrates that the community's interactions with Jewish authorities could result in lethal consequences for members actively engaging in public activity. These documented instances suggest that the Jerusalem community navigated a complex environment where local religious authority and Roman oversight intersected, requiring operational adaptation to maintain continuity. The earliest letters and documents also reflect concern with doctrinal consistency and the transmission of authoritative teaching. 1 Clement and Pauline correspondence indicate that the Jerusalem leadership guided communal disputes, ethical instruction, and ritual observance. The documentation of such oversight demonstrates that the community actively maintained standards of practice and interpretation derived from the Hebrew Scriptures, which provided the framework for instruction and identity. Evidence indicates that adherence to established practices was reinforced through letters, messengers, and gatherings, confirming a structured system of governance and communal continuity. During 33 to 36 AD, the Jerusalem community continued to expand its network of contacts. Communication reached towns in Judea and regions of Galilee, with evidence of informal leadership structures in these satellite communities. Letters reference communal coordination, the distribution of resources, and the maintenance of ethical and ritual norms, suggesting a deliberate effort to standardize practice and establish coherent organization. This network served as the foundation for the subsequent expansion of the movement throughout Judea, Samaria, and eventually beyond the immediate region, as documented in later letters and early writings such as 1 Clement. The interaction between domestic assemblies and local Jewish communities illustrates the community's adaptive strategies. Assemblies took place in private residences, consistent with archaeological evidence of large homes capable of hosting gatherings. The movement's reliance on domestic spaces allowed continuity while mitigating exposure to Roman authorities and local religious oversight. Evidence suggests that these domestic gatherings also facilitated instruction, communal decision-making, and coordination with leaders in Jerusalem, establishing operational precedents that persisted in subsequent decades. By 36 AD, the Jerusalem Christian community had established multiple documented features that persisted throughout the first century. By the mid-30s AD, the Christian movement that had developed in Jerusalem began to extend its presence beyond the city's confines. The Jerusalem community, composed primarily of Jewish members from Judea and Galilee, maintained structured leadership, communal gatherings, and written communication as documented in Pauline letters and early post-apostolic texts, including 1 Clement, c. 96 AD. The movement's initial growth outside Jerusalem is historically documented through references to specific figures such as Philip in Samaria and the activities of Saul of Tarsus, later Paul, whose engagement with Jewish and Gentile communities is preserved in letters and subsequent historical accounts. The expansion into Samaria represents one of the first documented moves of the Jerusalem community beyond its original urban center. Acts 8 describes Philip's activities, including travel to Samaritan towns to facilitate the dissemination of teachings. While the text in Acts provides narrative detail, the historical core is supported by references in early letters noting the extension of Jerusalem-based instructions to regional communities. Archaeological evidence confirms the existence of urban and semi-urban settlements in Samaria, with domestic spaces capable of accommodating gatherings for instruction, resource distribution, and coordinated community activities. These assemblies replicated structural patterns observed in Jerusalem, including leadership oversight, resource allocation, and ritual observance derived from Hebrew scriptures. During this period, the movement's demographic composition broadened to include individuals from neighboring regions and diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. Pauline correspondence indicates that members from Judea, Galilee, and surrounding areas participated in both communal gatherings and missionary activities. The structure of communication involved letters, messengers, and face-to-face interactions during travel between settlements. These mechanisms allowed for cohesion across geographically dispersed groups, documented in letters that reference instructions, ethical guidance, and communal regulation. Saul of Tarsus emerges in historical sources as a central figure in this expansion. While accounts of his earlier opposition to the Jerusalem movement appear in later writings, the earliest verifiable documentation comes from his letters, which reference his engagement with Jewish populations in Syria, Cilicia, and broader Asia Minor. His activities reflect a combination of travel, teaching, and correspondence with communities both previously established and newly formed. These letters provide evidence for organizational continuity, ethical instruction, and oversight, confirming a structured network extending beyond Jerusalem into multiple urban centers. Persecution in this period contributed to the movement's geographic dispersion. Historical context under Herod Agrippa I, R. 41 to 44 AD, provides evidence of heightened oversight and occasional executions within Jewish territories. Acts 12 records the execution of James, son of Zebedee, under Agrippa's authority. While the narrative details of Acts include theological interpretation, the core historical claim, that James was executed under Agrippa I, is corroborated by indirect references in early correspondence and later historical summaries, including Josephus' accounts of Herodian governance and political activity. Such actions demonstrate the external pressures that prompted members to relocate and establish communities in less politically sensitive areas. The expansion into Gentile populations represents a significant development in the movement's history. Evidence for engagement with Gentiles is documented in Pauline letters, particularly Galatians and 1 Thessalonians, which reference individuals of non-Jewish origin participating in communities initially established by Jewish believers. These letters confirm that Gentile members were integrated into assemblies, received instruction in ethical practices, and adhered to communal regulations derived from Hebrew scriptures, without requiring full observance of Jewish ritual law. The inclusion of Gentiles in structured gatherings indicates both the movement's adaptability and the early establishment of protocols to manage diversity within communities. Documentation indicates that the Jerusalem leadership maintained oversight. The movement's expansion was accompanied by the establishment of local leaders in newly formed communities. Letters and later post-apostolic texts indicate that elders or overseers were appointed to manage internal affairs, distribute resources, and maintain adherence to communal norms. These roles were documented in correspondence addressing ethical conduct, dispute resolution, and ritual practice, confirming the existence of an administrative hierarchy. Evidence demonstrates that these local leaders acted in consultation with, or in recognition of, the central Jerusalem authority, establishing an operational model that balanced autonomy with central oversight. The network of communication among early communities was essential to maintaining cohesion. Letters carried by designated messengers allowed the transfer of instructions, communal decisions, and ethical guidance across Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Pauline letters reference specific instructions regarding communal conduct, ethical standards, and management of internal disputes, reflecting the historical structure of oversight and coordination. The consistency of content and style across letters demonstrates an intentional effort to standardize practice and maintain unity among dispersed communities. By 44 AD, the movement had achieved a measurable geographic spread. Communities existed in Jerusalem, Judea outside the city, Samaria, and parts of Galilee. Each community reflected core elements documented in letters, leadership structures, communal gatherings in domestic spaces, resource allocation mechanisms, and participation of both men and women in operational roles. The integration of Gentile members, documented in Pauline correspondence, expanded the social composition of the movement while maintaining oversight and instruction consistent with Jerusalem-based practices. Political and social conditions continued to influence the movement's operations. Herod Agrippa I's reign demonstrates the potential for localized persecution, prompting members to relocate to less politically sensitive areas. Roman oversight ensured that communities operated within existing legal frameworks, constraining public assemblies while allowing household gatherings. Archaeological and textual evidence indicate that communities adapted to these constraints through private assemblies, correspondence, and appointment of local leadership, demonstrating organizational resilience. Economic activity and social support mechanisms were central to the functioning of these dispersed communities. Letters reference contributions to communal resources, provision for members lacking independent means, and coordinated assistance across communities. These mechanisms indicate that the movement developed a system of internal support, ensuring sustainability and continuity despite external pressures and geographic dispersion. The presence of organized resource distribution reflects both practical adaptation and structural continuity derived from the Jerusalem model. By the mid-1st century, the early Christian movement had moved beyond the boundaries of Jerusalem and Judea, entering a phase characterized by documented missionary activity, the establishment of communities in urban centers, and the circulation of letters that served as both organizational guidance and doctrinal instruction. The historical core of this period is primarily derived from the letters of Paul, known as the Pauline epistles, which are the earliest surviving Christian documents. alongside post-apostolic texts such as 1 Clement and Ignatius of Antioch, and corroborated by Roman administrative records detailing provincial governance and social conditions. Archaeological evidence also confirms the presence of urban settlements, trade routes, and household structures capable of supporting small assemblies for instruction and communal meals. Saul of Tarsus, who had earlier participated in actions against the Jerusalem community, is documented in letters written during this period as actively engaging in missions across the eastern Mediterranean. These letters provide direct evidence for his travels, interactions with diverse communities, and the establishment of congregations in multiple urban centers. While Acts provides narrative detail of his missions, the historical foundation rests on epistolary evidence, which records correspondence with communities in Galatia, Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, and other cities. These letters also confirm the existence of local leadership structures, including appointed elders or overseers, responsible for maintaining communal cohesion, ethical standards, and adherence to instruction received from Paul and, where applicable, the Jerusalem leadership. Paul's activities demonstrate a systematic approach to establishing and maintaining communities in regions under Roman administration. His letters reference the governance of cities such as Antioch in Syria, Ephesus in Asia Minor, and Corinth in Greece, all of which were important urban centers with administrative, economic, and social structures documented in Roman records. The selection of these cities reflects practical considerations for travel, communication, and the establishment of households suitable for assemblies. Archaeological evidence from Corinth and Ephesus confirms the presence of domestic spaces and commercial districts that would have facilitated the organization of gatherings and logistical support for nascent communities. The letters themselves document both the formation of congregations and the challenges encountered within them. 1 Corinthians, written in the mid-50s AD, addresses issues of internal organization, leadership, communal meals, and disputes among members. Galatians, written slightly earlier, provides guidance on the integration of Gentile members and the application of Jewish law within newly formed communities. 1 Thessalonians, among the earliest letters, documents both encouragement and instruction for a community in Macedonia, confirming the establishment of a network of communities connected through correspondence and travel. These letters collectively provide historically verifiable evidence for the operational and organizational methods employed by Paul and the early Christian leadership during this period. The integration of Gentile populations into these communities is a significant historical development. Paul's letters indicate that Gentiles were incorporated into assemblies without necessarily observing the full range of Jewish ritual practices. This evidence is particularly clear in Galatians, where correspondence addresses disputes regarding circumcision and adherence to Jewish law. The historical documentation demonstrates that early communities were managing social and religious diversity through instruction, governance, and oversight, rather than uniform enforcement of ritual law. This pragmatic approach is corroborated by subsequent post-apostolic writings, which recognize the authority of community leaders and elders in maintaining order and consistency across dispersed assemblies. Travel undertaken by Paul during this period is well documented through epistolary references, indicating multiple journeys through Asia Minor, Greece, and surrounding regions. His letters reference specific cities, including Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, and Galatia, and describe both the establishment of communities and the appointment of local leadership. The letters also reveal coordination with the Jerusalem leadership, particularly in matters of doctrinal clarification, ethical guidance, and the distribution of resources, indicating a hierarchical and connected network of communities spanning the Eastern Mediterranean. The evidence supports the conclusion that the early Christian movement had developed an operational model balancing local autonomy with central guidance from recognized leaders. The correspondence during this period also documents the mechanisms of communication and governance within and between communities. Letters carried by designated messengers facilitated the transmission of instructions, resolutions to disputes, and ethical guidance. 1 Corinthians addresses divisions within the congregation, providing historical evidence for structured oversight and the enforcement of communal norms. Galatians similarly documents corrective instruction and guidance regarding the integration of diverse populations. These letters reflect a deliberate, historically verifiable system of community organization, capable of sustaining multiple geographically dispersed assemblies while maintaining consistency in teaching and practice. Assemblies within these communities continued to be held predominantly in domestic settings, as corroborated by archaeological evidence from Corinth, Ephesus, and Philippi. Household structures in these urban centers provided secure venues for instruction, communal meals, and administrative coordination. References in letters to specific households, including those of Lydia and Philippi and Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth, demonstrate the reliance on private spaces for organized gatherings. The use of domestic spaces allowed for continuity of assembly despite potential oversight or interference from local authorities, including Roman officials responsible for urban security and taxation. Economic organization within communities is documented in letters addressing the collection and distribution of resources. 1 Corinthians 16 references contributions for the support of Jerusalem and Judean members, demonstrating a system of resource mobilization and transfer across regional networks. These provisions reflect coordinated planning, accountability, and logistical management, providing historical evidence for operational complexity within early communities. The letters also indicate the presence of members with sufficient means to facilitate both local and regional support, ensuring continuity and resilience of the community. Conflicts and disputes within communities, as documented in letters, provide insight into governance structures. 1 Corinthians addresses divisions among members, ethical disputes, and issues related to communal meals, while Galatians confronts challenges related to adherence to Jewish law among Gentile members. The letters demonstrate that early communities employed structured methods of conflict resolution and maintained documentation of decisions through correspondence, confirming the presence of recognized authority and procedural oversight. This historical evidence demonstrates operational continuity and the capacity for governance across archaeological surveys of domestic sites capable of hosting multiple occupants further support the practical involvement of women in assembly management and organizational support. By 57 AD, the early Christian movement under Paul had established an extensive network of communities across the Eastern Mediterranean. Political and social conditions continued to influence operations. Roman governance provided structured oversight in urban centers, with prefects and local officials maintaining order and managing taxation. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the movement adapted to these constraints by utilizing domestic spaces, appointing local leadership, and maintaining correspondence to ensure continuity. Letters demonstrate that operational and ethical instruction was reinforced across regions, supporting a sustainable model for dispersed communities. The period from 44 to 57 AD represents a critical phase in the historical development of the early Christian movement. Paul's documented missions and letters provide primary evidence for organizational structure, geographic expansion, communication networks, leadership hierarchies, integration of Gentiles, economic coordination, and conflict management. Assemblies were conducted in domestic settings, with participation from both men and women, under oversight structures that balanced local autonomy with recognition of central authority. The network established during this period laid the foundation for subsequent expansion, doctrinal consolidation, and community cohesion in the decades that followed. Archaeological evidence, Roman records, and epistolary documentation together confirm that by 57 AD, the early Christian movement had evolved into a structured, historically verifiable network capable of maintaining organizational continuity across multiple regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. By the late 40s AD, the early Christian movement had developed into a network of geographically dispersed communities spanning Judea, Galilee, Samaria, and regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, including urban centers in Asia Minor and Greece. Evidence for these communities is documented primarily through Pauline letters, early post-apostolic writings such as 1 Clement, and Roman administrative records documenting provincial structures, legal proceedings, and population demographics. Archaeological evidence, including domestic assemblages capable of hosting gatherings, supports textual documentation of structured assemblies and community organization. The period is distinguished by coordinated decision-making, formalized assemblies of leadership, and the resolution of issues arising from the integration of Gentile members into communities originally composed of Jews. The Jerusalem Council, as referenced in Acts 15 and indirectly corroborated by Pauline letters such as Galatians 2 verses 1 to 10, represents the earliest historically verifiable instance of a formal meeting of leaders from multiple communities to establish uniform practices. Historical analysis confirms that leadership from Jerusalem, including James, Peter, and other presiding elders, convened with representatives from communities established by Paul and others in Asia Minor. The core issues addressed were documented in letters, determining the extent to which Gentile members were required to observe Jewish ritual law, including circumcision, dietary regulations, and Sabbath observance. These records demonstrate a systematic approach to maintaining cohesion and operational consistency across geographically dispersed assemblies. Correspondence from Paul and later post-apostolic sources indicates that decisions were disseminated to communities through letters carried by designated messengers. These communications codified rulings, instructed local leadership on enforcement, and provided ethical and organizational guidance. Archaeological surveys of urban centers in Galatia, Corinth, and Antioch reveal structures suitable for domestic gatherings, confirming the feasibility of implementing centralized decisions across dispersed populations. These gatherings functioned as secure venues for instruction, communal decision-making, and administrative coordination while allowing continuity under Roman oversight. The Jerusalem leadership, particularly James, maintained oversight of the interpretation and implementation of decisions. 1 Clement, written decades later, references the continuity of leadership in Jerusalem and the transmission of instructions to distant communities. This evidence demonstrates the operational structure of early Christianity as hierarchical yet flexible, accommodating local circumstances while ensuring adherence to centralized directives. The documented presence of elders, overseers, and appointed leaders in both Jerusalem and regional communities reflects the establishment of administrative protocols that govern both daily conduct and broader organizational decisions. Pauline letters during this period provide specific evidence for the integration of Gentile members. Galatians 2 verses 3 to 5 documents the negotiation between Paul and Jerusalem leaders concerning the necessity of circumcision and adherence to Jewish dietary laws. These letters confirm that Gentile inclusion was subject to documented guidelines and oversight, ensuring consistent practice without imposing unnecessary burdens on community cohesion. Historical evidence suggests that these rulings were operationalized across multiple communities through correspondence, appointed leadership, and domestic assemblies, confirming a structured implementation process. The council's decisions were communicated to communities via letters and delegated representatives. Acts 15 verses 22 to 29 notes the selection of representatives to deliver rulings to Antioch, while epistolary evidence from Paul indicates that similar communications occurred in Galatia, Corinth, and other regions. These letters provided instruction on community organization, ethical conduct, and adherence to the guidelines established by the council. The process reflects a historically verifiable method of governance, combining centralized decision-making with localized implementation through trusted leadership structures. Conflict resolution was a central function of the council and subsequent correspondence. Disputes regarding ritual observance, doctrinal interpretation, and social inclusion were addressed through structured deliberation, documented decisions, and enforcement via community leadership. 1 Clement 47-49 references the exercise of oversight to maintain unity, prevent schisms, and enforce standards of practice across multiple regions. This evidence demonstrates that early Christian governance incorporated procedural mechanisms designed to sustain operational cohesion, reflecting a systematic approach to organizational management rather than reliance on informal consensus or individual discretion. The council period also coincides with continued expansion into urban centers under Roman administration. Cities such as Corinth, Ephesus, and Philippi, documented in letters and archaeological evidence, provided infrastructure for community gatherings, including domestic assemblies and small communal spaces capable of hosting meetings and instruction. These venues facilitated the implementation of council decisions, including ethical guidance, leadership instruction, and the integration of diverse populations. Household structures enabled secure meetings, supporting both communication with central leadership and localized decision-making. Women continued to participate actively in communities during this period. Pauline letters and early post-apostolic texts reference women such as Priscilla and Lydia, who hosted assemblies, facilitated instruction, and contributed to the operational logistics of gatherings. This participation is documented as consistent with both the domestic setting of assemblies and the broader organizational needs of the movement. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of households capable of accommodating communal activities, confirming the practical integration of women into operational roles. Economic coordination across communities is documented through letters detailing contributions for the support of Jerusalem and Judean members. These letters reference the collection, transfer, and distribution of resources across regions, demonstrating the presence of organized systems for financial support. Acts 11 verses 27 to 30 notes the collection of resources for famine relief in Judea, reflecting coordinated administrative activity across geographically dispersed communities. Such documentation confirms that economic management was an integral component of organizational continuity, implemented in parallel with ethical instruction, leadership oversight, and operational coordination. By 60 AD, the early Christian movement had consolidated its leadership structures and operational frameworks in response to the challenges of geographic dispersion and social diversity. Roman oversight continued to shape operational parameters for assemblies and community activity. Provincial governors and local authorities maintained control over public gatherings, legal disputes, and taxation. Archaeological evidence indicates that domestic settings provided a practical solution to potential oversight, enabling continuity of instruction and governance. Letters and correspondence ensured that community guidance and ethical standards were disseminated and implemented effectively despite external pressures. The period from 49 to 60 AD represents a historically documented consolidation of the early Christian movement, characterized by coordinated governance, formalized decision-making, structured communication, integration of diverse populations, and operational resilience. Leadership in Jerusalem maintained oversight of dispersed communities, ensuring adherence to established practices while allowing flexibility to accommodate regional circumstances. Letters served as both administrative tools and operational guidance, confirming the existence of a historically verifiable network of communities unified through documented communication and leadership structures. Assemblies continued to be organized within domestic spaces capable of hosting instruction, meals, and administrative coordination. Archaeological evidence from urban centers across Judea, Galatia, and Greece corroborates the presence of domestic architecture suitable for these purposes. These structures facilitated continuity of practice, leadership oversight, and implementation of council decisions, enabling communities to maintain cohesion. The period 49 to 60 AD marks a critical phase in the historical development of the early Christian movement. The Jerusalem Council and subsequent correspondence provide documented evidence for centralized decision-making, operational coordination, integration of diverse populations, leadership oversight, and structured communication. Assemblies continued to function within domestic settings, with participation from both men and women. Archaeological evidence and letters confirm that these frameworks allowed the movement to maintain cohesion, manage disputes, allocate resources, and implement standardized practices. By 60 AD, the early Christian movement had transitioned from a collection of dispersed communities into a historically verifiable network with structured governance, operational continuity, and documented mechanisms for expansion and integration. By 60 AD, the early Christian movement had established a network of communities spanning Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, Samaria, and urban centers in the eastern Mediterranean, including Asia Minor and Greece. This expansion was documented primarily through Pauline letters, other early epistles, post-apostolic writings such as 1 Clement, Ignatius of Antioch, and Roman administrative records regarding provincial governance and civil disturbances. Archaeological evidence confirms the existence of domestic spaces used for communal gatherings, supporting textual documentation of structured assemblies, leadership oversight, and resource coordination. The period 60 to 70 AD is distinguished by continued expansion, increasing integration of Gentile members, the establishment of operational protocols across dispersed communities, and the emergence of early persecution under local Jewish authorities and Roman provincial oversight. Paul's missionary activity during this period continued to be central to the expansion of the movement. Letters written to communities in Galatia, Corinth, Philippi, and Thessalonica document visits, guidance, and organizational oversight. These letters provide historically verifiable evidence of the processes by which new communities were established and integrated into a wider network connected to Jerusalem. Archaeological surveys of cities such as Corinth and Ephesus confirm the presence of domestic structures suitable for instruction, communal meals, and organizational gatherings, corresponding with textual references to household assemblies and the use of private spaces for community coordination. The integration of Gentile members remained a primary concern for leadership. Pauline's correspondence emphasizes practical guidance on inclusion, ethical instruction, and community cohesion. Galatians and 1 Thessalonians contain directives addressing the participation of non-Jewish members without imposing full adherence to Jewish ritual law. Letters indicate that Gentile integration was monitored and guided by appointed elders and overseers, ensuring compliance with community norms while preserving operational continuity. The process was implemented through correspondence, personal visits, and delegated messengers, creating a historically verifiable administrative network spanning multiple regions. The Jerusalem leadership maintained oversight of post-council implementation. 1 Clement and references in Pauline letters indicate that James and other Jerusalem authorities continued to provide instruction and guidance to communities beyond Judea, confirming the persistence of hierarchical structures. This oversight was exercised without centralizing control to the point of impeding local organization, reflecting a balance between operational guidance and regional autonomy. Letters and post-apostolic writings document the mechanisms by which directives were transmitted, interpreted, and applied, confirming that the early Christian movement had developed an organized administrative system capable of sustaining dispersed communities. Early persecution during this period is documented in both textual and historical sources. Acts 21-23 records that Paul faced arrest in Jerusalem, though the narrative details contain theological interpretation. The core historical elements, confirmed by Roman administrative practices and references to civil disturbance, indicate that Jewish authorities in Jerusalem and surrounding regions acted against members perceived as challenging traditional structures. Post-apostolic texts confirm that leaders such as James remained operational despite localized threats. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that assemblies continued in domestic settings, mitigating exposure to potential threats while allowing continuity of instruction and community governance. The outbreak of tensions in Jerusalem is historically documented in the context of the wider political environment under Roman provincial governance. The prefects and procurators, including Antonius Felix, are early Christian communities in Jerusalem, though primarily composed of Jewish members, were directly affected, prompting dispersal into the surrounding regions of Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. Historical sources, including post-apostolic texts like 1 Clement and letters from Pauline and other early Christian figures, document both the displacement of members and the consolidation of communities in previously established centers, particularly in urban hubs of the Eastern Mediterranean. The dispersal of Jerusalem Christians led to an accelerated emphasis on Gentile communities. By this period, communities in Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, and Galatia had become central to the operational structure of the movement. Letters from Paul and other early documents indicate that these communities functioned as organizational hubs, integrating displaced Jewish members alongside existing Gentile adherents. Archaeological surveys of domestic spaces in Corinth and Ephesus confirm the existence of structures capable of hosting assemblies, communal meals, and leadership meetings, corroborating textual evidence for operational continuity in regions outside Judea. These settlements relied on local elders and appointed overseers to manage instruction, ethical oversight, and logistical organization, reflecting the administrative framework previously centralized in Jerusalem. Correspondence during this period demonstrates the continued reliance on written letters as a primary tool for governance, doctrinal instruction, and community cohesion. Pauline letters, including Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Galatians, document directives related to ethical conduct, conflict resolution, and integration of diverse populations. The letters also confirm ongoing coordination with recognized leadership structures, including those historically associated with Jerusalem, even after the city's destruction. This demonstrates a historically verifiable continuity of governance and operational oversight that transcended localized disruptions caused by political and military events. The integration of Gentile members intensified during this period, with documented guidance addressing both religious observance and communal practice. Letters such as Galatians emphasize that Gentile members were incorporated into communities without being subjected to full Jewish ritual law, including circumcision and dietary regulations. This historical evidence reflects the operational decision-making processes that ensured both continuity and cohesion in communities experiencing demographic and cultural shifts. Correspondence also indicates that elders and overseers were responsible for monitoring adherence to communal norms, confirming the implementation of structured oversight across dispersed assemblies. Assemblies continued to be conducted predominantly in domestic settings. Archaeological evidence from urban centers, including Corinth, Philippi, and Ephesus, reveals household structures capable of accommodating multiple families, communal meals, and instructional gatherings. Textual documentation from Pauline letters and post-apostolic writings consistently references the use of household venues, confirming the continuation of domestic assemblies as a historically verified method of sustaining instruction, leadership, and operational cohesion during the post-Jerusalem dispersal. These gatherings were also essential for maintaining economic coordination, as letters indicate ongoing collection and distribution of resources to support both local and displaced members. Leadership structures remained centralized within a decentralized operational framework. Appointed elders and overseers in dispersed communities were responsible for ethical instruction, dispute resolution, and logistical management. Letters from Paul, including 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians, provide evidence for structured governance, with specific directives addressing conduct, leadership succession, and conflict mediation. Post-apostolic texts, such as 1 Clement, corroborate these practices by emphasizing continuity of oversight and instruction across dispersed regions. The historical record confirms that leadership roles were both functional and organizational, ensuring operational stability despite geographic and social dispersal. Economic organization continued to be a defining feature of community sustainability. Letters document coordinated collections to support members in Judea, including famine relief and provision for displaced populations. 1 Corinthians 16 and Acts 11 verses 27 to 30 provide independent confirmation of resource mobilization and logistical planning across communities. Archaeological evidence indicates storage spaces within domestic settings and communal facilities for the distribution of resources, corroborating textual documentation. The historical record establishes that economic coordination was an integral aspect of operational continuity during this period of dispersal and consolidation. Conflict resolution mechanisms were actively employed to maintain cohesion. Disputes concerning leadership, ritual observance, or ethical conduct were addressed through structured communication, including letters and delegated oversight by elders. Pauline correspondence addresses conflicts in Corinth, Galatia, and Thessalonica, providing historically verifiable evidence for procedural resolution and enforcement of communal norms. Post-apostolic writings, including 1 Clement, emphasize hierarchical mediation and the continuity of leadership to ensure uniformity of practice, confirming that structured governance was maintained even under conditions of geographic dispersion. The political context of 70 to 80 AD continued to influence community operations. Roman oversight, documented in administrative records, ensured monitoring of public gatherings, legal adjudication, and taxation. Displaced members of the Jerusalem community operated under these constraints, relying on domestic assemblies for security, instruction, and organizational coordination. Letters indicate that community operations were adapted to local conditions while maintaining doctrinal and operational continuity across dispersed regions. The integration of Gentiles into these communities further facilitated operational stability, as larger populations enabled more robust assembly structures and resource mobilization. Women continued to play operational roles within domestic assemblies. References to figures such as Priscilla and Lydia in Pauline letters indicate active participation in hosting gatherings, instruction, and logistical management. Archaeological surveys of domestic spaces corroborate the capacity of households to support communal activities, confirming that women contributed to operational functions within communities. This evidence demonstrates a historically verifiable pattern of inclusion in practical and organizational aspects of assembly life during this period of consolidation. By 80 AD, the early Christian movement had undergone a significant transformation. Jerusalem, once the central hub, had been destroyed, and communities outside Judea, particularly Gentile-dominated assemblies, had become the primary operational centers. The destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersal of its communities accelerated the operational centrality of Gentile assemblies, which became focal points for instruction, coordination, and expansion. Letters from Paul and post-apostolic writings provide historically verifiable documentation of these processes, confirming the structural and administrative evolution of the early Christian movement. Archaeological evidence of domestic assemblies and urban infrastructure supports textual documentation, establishing a historically accurate picture of community life, governance, and operational continuity during 70 to 80 AD. Operational resilience during this period was achieved through a combination of leadership oversight, structured communication, domestic assemblies, economic coordination, and the integration of diverse populations. Letters confirm that community practices, ethical instruction, and leadership directives were standardized and applied across multiple regions, ensuring continuity despite the loss of Jerusalem as the central hub. Post-apostolic texts further corroborate the effectiveness of these organizational mechanisms, emphasizing hierarchical continuity, doctrinal instruction, and the maintenance of operational cohesion across dispersed communities. The period 70 to 80 AD is thus historically significant as a phase of adaptation and consolidation. Dispersal due to the destruction of Jerusalem resulted in both the expansion of Gentile-dominated assemblies and the establishment of operational protocols capable of sustaining geographically dispersed communities. Leadership structures, domestic assemblies, economic coordination, communication networks, and conflict resolution mechanisms collectively ensured continuity of practice and governance. Women's active participation and the structured integration of Gentile members further strengthened community operations. Archaeological and textual evidence together document a historically verifiable network of early Christian communities capable of sustaining growth, coordination, and continuity despite political, social, and geographic challenges. By the 80s AD, the early Christian movement had evolved into a geographically dispersed network of communities encompassing Asia Minor, Greece, Macedonia, and regions surrounding the Eastern Mediterranean. The documented historical record for this period relies primarily on Pauline letters written before his death, epistolary evidence attributed to John post-apostolic writings, including 1 Clement and the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, as well as Roman administrative documentation detailing provincial governance and legal oversight. Archaeological evidence from urban centers such as Ephesus, Smyrna, Corinth, and Philippi corroborates textual references to domestic assemblies, meeting spaces, and logistical support structures, providing material confirmation of operational continuity, leadership organization, and community expansion. The destruction of Jerusalem a decade earlier had shifted the operational center of Christianity from a predominantly Jewish context to predominantly Gentile urban communities. Cities in Asia Minor, including Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Colossae, emerged as hubs for instruction, administration, and community coordination. Pauline letters to Ephesus, Philippi, and Colossae, although written in earlier decades, continued to circulate, functioning as operational tools for governance, ethical instruction, and doctrinal guidance. Epistolary transmission relied on designated messengers, confirming a historically verifiable communication network linking dispersed assemblies across multiple provinces. The letters attributed to John, composed during this period, provide additional documentation of early community practices, leadership structures, and doctrinal instruction. These letters, addressed to assemblies in Asia Minor, refer to local elders, instructions for ethical conduct, and mechanisms for addressing internal disputes. References to specific cities such as Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum corroborate the geographic expansion documented in archaeological evidence, confirming the operational role of these urban centers as hubs for governance, instruction, and logistical coordination. Assemblies continued to be primarily organized in domestic settings. Archaeological surveys of houses in Ephesus, Smyrna, and Corinth indicate sufficient capacity to host gatherings for instruction, communal meals, and administrative meetings. These spaces provided secure venues under Roman oversight for the continuation of community operations. Textual documentation in letters of John, Pauline correspondence, and post-apostolic writings confirms that domestic assemblies facilitated instruction, coordination, and ethical enforcement across multiple, dispersed communities. Leadership structures remained consistent with previously documented practices. Elders and overseers were appointed to maintain operational continuity, manage instruction, resolve disputes, and coordinate resource distribution. Letters from John and post-apostolic texts, such as 1 Clement, emphasized the continuity of leadership and hierarchical oversight, ensuring adherence to ethical standards and doctrinal directives. Historical documentation demonstrates that leadership roles were functional, administrative, and accountable, maintaining cohesion within communities despite geographic dispersion and the absence of Jerusalem as the operational hub. Economic organization during this period continued to support both local and displaced members. Letters reference the collection and distribution of resources, including provision for Gentile and Jewish populations residing in Asia Minor. Material evidence from domestic and communal spaces supports the existence of storage and distribution operations. Correspondence confirms that resource mobilization was coordinated through appointed elders and overseers, providing continuity and stability across dispersed communities. These practices reflect a structured approach to operational governance verified by textual and archaeological evidence. Conflict resolution was a documented operational priority. The letters of John and Pauline's correspondence reference disputes concerning doctrinal clarity, ethical conduct, and leadership authority. Post-apostolic texts such as 1 Clement highlight the mediation exercised by recognized leaders, confirming procedural governance mechanisms. Historical evidence indicates that disputes were addressed through communication, written instruction, and structured leadership oversight, ensuring that community cohesion was maintained across urban centers in Asia Minor and Greece. The integration of Gentile members into communities remained a central operational feature. Letters address guidance on ethical conduct, ritual observance, and communal participation, confirming historical practices of inclusion without imposing full Jewish ritual law. Correspondence indicates that Gentile integration was monitored by elders and overseers, providing documented evidence of operational oversight in culturally diverse urban assemblies. Archaeological surveys of urban domestic sites further confirm the practical implementation of these integration strategies. Political conditions continued to influence community operations. Roman administrative oversight, recorded in provincial records, ensured monitoring of public assemblies, adjudication of legal disputes, and enforcement of civic obligations. Communities relied on domestic assemblies to maintain instruction, coordination, and operational security. Letters provide evidence for pragmatic adaptation to local political constraints while maintaining doctrinal and organizational continuity across dispersed assemblies in Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. Women continued to occupy active operational roles. References in letters of John and Pauline correspondence indicate participation in hosting assemblies, instruction, and logistical support. Archaeological evidence of domestic spaces in Ephesus, Smyrna, and Corinth confirms that households were suitable for communal activities, providing practical venues for women to contribute to assembly operations. This confirms a historically verifiable pattern of inclusion in operational and organizational responsibilities during the 80s AD. By 90 AD, the movement had consolidated operationally across multiple urban centers. The period also documents the beginning of textual consolidation, with letters of John and post-apostolic writings serving as operational guides for ethical, doctrinal, and administrative practices. These texts were circulated, read publicly within domestic assemblies, and preserved for reference, confirming a historically verifiable method for maintaining coherence across dispersed communities. Archaeological evidence aligns with textual records, supporting the operational and practical frameworks for instruction, assembly, and governance. Operational continuity relied on structured leadership, secure domestic assemblies, systematic communication, and economic coordination. Letters document ethical instruction, doctrinal guidance, and conflict resolution, providing evidence for sustained organizational protocols across multiple urban centers. Post-apostolic texts emphasize the preservation of leadership succession and the enforcement of ethical and doctrinal norms, confirming the historically documented mechanisms by which dispersed communities maintained operational cohesion. By the conclusion of the decade, early Christian communities in Asia Minor and Greece had developed into historically verifiable operational networks. Leadership structures, domestic assemblies, communication systems, economic coordination, and the inclusion of women in operational roles collectively ensured continuity and sustainability. Letters of John, Pauline correspondence, and post-apostolic writings confirm the establishment of structured governance and documented guidance, enabling dispersed communities to function effectively despite distance from the former Jerusalem hub. This decade, 80 to 90 AD, represents a critical phase in the historically documented expansion and consolidation of the early Christian movement. Urban centers in Asia Minor and Greece emerged as primary operational hubs. Domestic assemblies functioned as secure venues for instruction and coordination, and leadership structures ensured consistent application of guidance across dispersed populations. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms the integration of Gentile members, economic resource coordination, conflict resolution mechanisms, and operational continuity under Roman oversight. These features collectively provide a historically verifiable account of the movement's consolidation and expansion during the 80s AD. By 90 AD, the early Christian movement had transitioned into a decentralized yet operationally coordinated network of communities spanning Asia Minor, Greece, Macedonia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The period is documented through post-apostolic texts, letters of John, fragments of earlier Pauline correspondence, 1 Clement, Ignatius of Antioch, and Roman administrative records concerning provincial governance, public order, and taxation. Archaeological evidence from urban centers such as Ephesus, Smyrna, Corinth, and Philippi confirms the continued use of domestic spaces for assemblies, communal meals, instruction, and leadership coordination. These findings support the textual record indicating structured governance and operational continuity across geographically dispersed communities. This decade marks the consolidation of post-apostolic leadership following the deaths of the original apostles. Leadership roles, including elders and overseers, are consistently documented in letters and post-apostolic writings as responsible for doctrinal instruction, conflict resolution, and operational coordination. 1 Clement emphasizes continuity of governance and the preservation of hierarchical structures, ensuring adherence to community norms and ethical instruction. Archaeological surveys of urban domestic spaces indicate that these leadership functions were implemented within household assemblies capable of hosting gatherings, instruction, and administrative activity. Letters of John, written during this period, address multiple communities in Asia Minor, including Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum. These texts document operational concerns, ethical guidance, and mechanisms for resolving internal disputes. Epistolary references to elders, teachers, and community members provide historical evidence of structured oversight, confirming operational continuity across multiple assemblies. The letters also reflect the expansion of Gentile membership, emphasizing inclusion and guidance on communal practices without imposing full Jewish ritual observance. These letters function both as doctrinal instruction and operational governance, distributed through designated messengers to maintain coordination among dispersed communities. The consolidation of communities involved the establishment of standardized operational procedures. Elders and overseers were responsible for implementing instructions regarding communal meals, ethical conduct, resource distribution, and conflict resolution. Pauline correspondence, post-apostolic texts, and letters of John collectively document these practices, confirming that operational cohesion was maintained despite the absence of Jerusalem as a central hub. Archaeological evidence of domestic assemblies corroborates the textual record, showing the practical implementation of governance, instruction, and logistical coordination in urban centers. Economic coordination remained a central operational function. Letters and post-apostolic writings reference contributions to support both local communities and displaced members, including those remaining in Judea and Galilee. Acts 11 verses 27 to 30 and 1 Corinthians 16 document systematic collection and distribution processes, confirmed by material evidence of storage areas in domestic spaces used for communal provisioning. Historical documentation demonstrates that operational procedures for resource management were implemented by appointed leaders, ensuring the continuity and sustainability of dispersed communities. Conflict resolution mechanisms were explicitly codified during this period. Letters of John, Pauline correspondence, and 1 Clement reference disputes regarding doctrinal interpretation, ethical conduct, and leadership authority. Hierarchical oversight ensured mediation, continuity of instruction, and enforcement of community norms. Archaeological and textual evidence indicate that these processes were applied consistently across assemblies in Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece, confirming a historically verifiable framework for governance and dispute resolution within dispersed communities. The operational integration of Gentile members continued as a primary concern. Letters and post-apostolic writings document practical guidance regarding ethical behavior, participation in assemblies, and adherence to community norms. Gentile inclusion was systematically monitored and coordinated by elders and overseers, providing historically verifiable evidence of operational oversight. Archaeological evidence from urban domestic spaces supports textual references to assemblies where integrated communities could gather for instruction, meals, and administrative activities, demonstrating effective operational cohesion in culturally diverse populations. Women's participation in community operations remained consistent with earlier decades. References in letters of John, Pauline correspondence, and post-apostolic texts document their role in hosting assemblies, facilitating instruction, and supporting logistical functions. Archaeological evidence confirms that domestic spaces could accommodate communal activities, providing the practical infrastructure for female participation in operational and administrative tasks. This consistent historical documentation demonstrates that women contributed to the practical functioning and sustainability of assemblies during this period of consolidation. The decade 90 to 100 AD also reflects the continued development of written documentation as a central operational tool. Letters of John, 1 Clement, and other post-apostolic writings were circulated to provide standardized instruction, guidance on ethical conduct, and directives for community governance. These texts were read publicly within assemblies, ensuring continuity of instruction and operational cohesion. Material and textual evidence confirm that written documentation served as a historically verifiable method of maintaining consistency across geographically dispersed communities, bridging communication gaps, and supporting governance structures. Political and social conditions under Roman provincial administration continued to influence community operations. Roman records confirm the monitoring of public gatherings, legal adjudication, and oversight of civic obligations. Communities relied on domestic assemblies for secure instruction, coordination, and logistical management, adapting practices to comply with local regulations while maintaining doctrinal and operational integrity. Archaeological evidence aligns with textual references, confirming the use of secure domestic venues in urban centers such as Ephesus, Smyrna, Corinth, and Philippi. By 100 AD, the early Christian movement had consolidated its operational networks, integrating communities across Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. The consolidation of post-apostolic communities established a historically verifiable operational network capable of sustaining growth, integration, and administrative coordination. Leadership structures, domestic assemblies, written communication, resource coordination, and conflict resolution mechanisms collectively ensured continuity and cohesion. Letters of John, Pauline correspondence, and post-apostolic writings functioned as operational guides for dispersed communities, enabling consistent practice, doctrinal instruction, and ethical oversight. Archaeological evidence confirms the practical implementation of these operational mechanisms in urban domestic spaces. By the end of this decade, early Christian communities had developed into a historically verifiable network of organized, operationally coherent assemblies across Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. Leadership, written documentation, domestic assemblies, economic coordination, and operational oversight ensured continuity, stability, and integration of diverse populations. Gentile inclusion, female participation, and adaptation to Roman administrative constraints contributed to operational resilience, confirming the historically documented structures and procedures of the early Christian movement by 100 AD. By 100 AD, early Christian communities had extended across a broad expanse of the Roman Empire, including Asia Minor, Greece, Macedonia, and parts of Italy, particularly Rome itself. Historical documentation for this period includes post-apostolic letters, writings of early church leaders such as Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna, fragments of previous apostolic correspondence, and Roman records concerning provincial governance, taxation, and public order. Archaeological evidence from urban centers such as Ephesus, Smyrna, Corinth, Philippi, Rome, and smaller towns confirms the existence of domestic assemblies, meeting spaces, and infrastructure capable of supporting communal meals, instruction, and leadership coordination. The early decades of the 2nd century represent a period of operational expansion and consolidation. Letters of Clement of Rome, composed around 96 AD, provide detailed historical evidence of leadership structures, conflict resolution mechanisms, and community cohesion in urban centers of Italy. 1 Clement addresses disputes within the Roman community concerning the removal or reinstatement of leaders, emphasizing structured governance, procedural oversight, and adherence to operational norms. Archaeological surveys of Roman domestic spaces support textual evidence of assemblies capable of hosting gatherings for instruction, conflict resolution, and administrative coordination. Ignatius of Antioch, writing in the early 100s AD during his travels toward Rome, documents operational protocols, community governance, and doctrinal instruction in multiple urban centers of Asia Minor. His letters to Ephesus, Smyrna, Magnesia, Tralles, Philadelphia, and Rome emphasize the appointment of bishops, elders, and deacons, providing historically verifiable evidence for the formalization of hierarchical leadership structures. These letters reflect coordinated operational practices, including oversight of instruction, dispute resolution, ethical guidance, and communication between assemblies, confirming a networked organizational system across the Roman Empire. Polycarp of Smyrna, documented through letters and post-apostolic writings, demonstrates continuity of operational leadership in Asia Minor. Polycarp's correspondence emphasizes the role of elders and overseers in instruction, governance, and coordination, confirming the persistence of hierarchical and functional structures initially established in earlier decades. Archaeological evidence from Smyrna and surrounding towns corroborates textual documentation, showing domestic spaces utilized for communal gatherings, leadership meetings, and logistical operations. These records collectively establish a historically verifiable framework for the management and coordination of dispersed Christian communities. Expansion during this period was facilitated by the continued use of domestic assemblies as primary venues for instruction, communal meals, and governance. Archaeological surveys of urban domestic sites in Ephesus, Smyrna, Corinth, Rome, and Philippi confirm sufficient capacity to accommodate multiple families, leaders, and communal activities. Textual references from Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp corroborate the operational use of these spaces, providing secure environments for instruction, coordination, and continuity under Roman oversight. These assemblies functioned as both practical and administrative centers, ensuring the sustainability of dispersed communities. Leadership structures were further formalized during this decade. Bishops, elders, and deacons are consistently referenced in letters of Ignatius and post-apostolic writings, indicating a functional hierarchy responsible for doctrinal instruction, dispute mediation, and operational coordination. Letters from Clement of Rome confirm the procedural enforcement of leadership norms, including the removal, appointment, or reinstatement of leaders, demonstrating historically verifiable governance protocols. Archaeological evidence supports the practical implementation of these structures within domestic assemblies, demonstrating operational continuity across dispersed urban centers. Communication networks remained critical to operational cohesion. Letters, dispatched via designated messengers, ensured that directives, ethical instruction, and conflict resolution guidance reached all communities. Pauline correspondence, post-apostolic texts, and letters of Ignatius document the systematic transmission of instruction and operational oversight. This correspondence provided historically verifiable evidence of centralized coordination applied across geographically dispersed communities, ensuring consistent practice and adherence to operational standards. Economic coordination continued to be a defining operational function. Letters and post-apostolic texts reference contributions to support local communities, displaced populations, and operational infrastructure. Archaeological evidence confirms storage facilities within domestic and communal spaces, supporting systematic collection and distribution of resources. Historical records demonstrate that appointed leaders were responsible for overseeing resource mobilization, confirming the practical implementation of coordinated operational structures across dispersed communities. Conflict resolution mechanisms were codified and applied consistently. Letters of Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp provide evidence of procedural mediation regarding doctrinal disputes, ethical conduct, and leadership authority. Hierarchical oversight ensured continuity, standardized practice, and operational cohesion. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that these processes were implemented across assemblies in urban centers throughout the Roman Empire, establishing historically verifiable governance frameworks. The integration of Gentile members remained a primary operational concern. Letters and post-apostolic writings document guidance on ethical conduct, communal participation, and inclusion without imposing full Jewish ritual law. Elders and overseers monitored adherence to these operational norms, providing historically verifiable evidence for practical oversight of culturally diverse communities. Archaeological surveys corroborate textual documentation, showing that domestic spaces were utilized to host integrated assemblies with coordinated instruction, meals, and operational activities. Women's participation continued to be documented in operational roles. References in letters of Ignatius, Clement, and Polycarp indicate the hosting of assemblies, facilitation of instruction, and logistical support. Archaeological evidence of domestic assemblies confirms sufficient capacity for women to participate in organizational functions, supporting operational and administrative continuity. Historical documentation demonstrates that female participation in practical and logistical roles contributed to the sustainability and cohesion of communities during this decade. By 110 AD, the early Christian movement had established structured operational networks across the Roman Empire. The early decades of the 2nd century demonstrate that operational expansion was accompanied by formalized governance and standardized practices. Letters of Ignatius and Clement, supported by archaeological evidence, confirm the structured organization, leadership hierarchy, and operational continuity of dispersed assemblies. The consolidation of Gentile communities, integration of women in practical roles, and coordination of resources under appointed leaders contributed to the resilience and sustainability of early Christian networks. This period also reflects the maturation of written documentation as a tool for operational governance. Letters and post-apostolic texts were circulated, read publicly in domestic assemblies, and preserved for ongoing reference. These documents provided operational instruction, doctrinal guidance, ethical norms, and procedural oversight. Archaeological evidence corroborates the practical implementation of these procedures, confirming that domestic assemblies functioned as secure venues for coordination, instruction, and logistical management across dispersed communities. By the conclusion of this decade, early Christian communities had developed into historically verifiable operational networks spanning the Roman Empire. Leadership structures, domestic assemblies, communication networks, economic coordination, conflict resolution mechanisms, and inclusion of Gentile members collectively ensured continuity, cohesion, and resilience. Women's participation in organizational and logistical roles, combined with systematic written instruction and hierarchical oversight, enabled communities to maintain consistent practices and operational stability despite geographic dispersion and political oversight. The decade 100 to 110 AD thus represents a period of consolidation, formalization, and operational expansion. Urban centers in Italy, Greece, Macedonia, and Asia Minor functioned as hubs for governance, instruction, and coordination. Domestic assemblies provided secure venues for leadership, instruction, and operational management. Leadership hierarchies, codified instructions, resource coordination, conflict resolution mechanisms, and communication networks collectively ensured operational continuity across dispersed communities. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms the historically verifiable development of structured Christian networks capable of sustaining growth, governance, and doctrinal continuity in the early 2nd century. By the early decades of the 2nd century, specifically 110 to 120 AD, early Christian communities had matured into operationally coordinated networks extending across Asia Minor. Greece, Macedonia, and Italy, with documented presence in Rome, Ephesus, Smyrna, Corinth, Philippi, and smaller urban centers of the Roman Empire. Historical sources for this period include post-apostolic writings, letters of Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Rome, fragments of earlier apostolic correspondence, and Roman administrative records detailing provincial governance, taxation, and public assembly oversight. Archaeological evidence supports textual references, showing domestic and urban spaces functioning as venues for instruction, communal gatherings, leadership coordination, and resource distribution. During this period, communities experienced operational maturation, evidenced by the consolidation of leadership, codification of procedural norms, and distribution of texts for doctrinal instruction and community governance. Letters of Ignatius, written during his journey to Rome, provide extensive documentation of the role of bishops, elders, and deacons in maintaining cohesion across dispersed assemblies. Ignatius emphasizes hierarchical oversight, operational coordination, and doctrinal continuity, demonstrating historically verifiable mechanisms for sustaining community operations under conditions of geographic dispersion and Roman administrative control. The codification and circulation of texts reached new prominence in these decades. Letters of Ignatius, alongside 1 Clement and the correspondence of Polycarp, served dual functions: doctrinal instruction and operational governance. Texts were read publicly in domestic assemblies, providing standardization in teaching, ethical instruction, and leadership practice. Archaeological evidence confirms that domestic and urban spaces were utilized for reading, discussion, and administrative coordination, substantiating the historical reality of written documentation as a central operational tool for dispersed communities. Leadership structures achieved operational stability through formalized roles and responsibilities. Bishops were increasingly recognized as central figures responsible for doctrinal instruction, conflict resolution, and coordination between dispersed communities. Elders and deacons supported bishops by overseeing local assemblies, managing economic resources, and ensuring adherence to operational protocols. Letters of Ignatius, Clement, and Polycarp document these structures, providing historically verifiable evidence for hierarchical and functional governance within dispersed networks. Archaeological surveys of domestic spaces in Ephesus, Smyrna, Corinth, Rome, and Philippi confirmed the practical implementation of these leadership structures, as spaces were adapted to accommodate gatherings, instruction, and operational coordination. Operational coordination relied on structured communication networks. Letters, sent via designated messengers, provided guidance on ethical conduct, doctrinal interpretation, leadership protocols, and dispute resolution. Correspondence facilitated cohesion between dispersed assemblies, ensuring consistency in practice and adherence to established operational norms. Historical documentation confirms that these communication systems were systematically implemented, linking communities in Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, and Italy, and maintaining continuity despite geographic separation and Roman oversight. Economic and logistical coordination remained central to community operations. Texts document the collection and distribution of resources to support local assemblies and displaced populations. Archaeological evidence of storage areas, domestic courtyards, and urban spaces used for provisioning supports textual records. Leaders, particularly elders and deacons, were responsible for ensuring equitable distribution and resource sustainability, confirming the operational efficiency of dispersed networks. This integration of economic management with leadership oversight represents a historically documented mechanism for sustaining growth and continuity. Conflict resolution mechanisms were further formalized during 110 to 120 AD. Letters of Ignatius and Clement provide evidence for structured approaches to disputes regarding doctrinal interpretation, ethical compliance, and leadership authority. Post-apostolic texts emphasize hierarchical mediation and accountability, demonstrating consistent procedural enforcement across assemblies. Archaeological evidence indicates that domestic assembly spaces functioned as venues for gatherings, dispute resolution, and administrative coordination, confirming the historically verifiable application of operational governance. The integration of Gentile members continued as a primary operational focus. Texts document practical instructions for participation, ethical conduct, and inclusion in communal assemblies without adherence to full Jewish ritual law. Elders and overseers monitored implementation, providing historically verifiable oversight for culturally diverse populations. Archaeological findings in urban domestic settings corroborate textual records, confirming that integrated assemblies were conducted systematically across multiple regions of the Roman Empire. Women remained active participants in operational roles. Letters and post-apostolic writings document their engagement in hosting assemblies, facilitating instruction, and supporting logistical coordination. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites confirms spatial capacity for gatherings and operational functions, substantiating the practical inclusion of women in maintaining community cohesion and continuity. Historical records demonstrate that female involvement in operational and organizational roles was consistent and integral to the sustainability of networks. By 120 AD, early Christian communities had developed into historically verifiable, mature networks characterized by structured governance, operational cohesion, and coordinated instruction. The operational maturity of this period is evidenced by the sustained implementation of leadership structures, communication networks, codified texts, economic coordination, and conflict resolution protocols. Assemblies, conducted in domestic spaces, provided secure and functional venues for instruction, operational governance, and community gatherings. Archaeological and textual evidence together substantiate the historically verifiable establishment of coherent, structured networks capable of sustaining doctrinal instruction, ethical oversight, and operational continuity across dispersed urban centers. The consolidation of texts during 110 to 120 AD reflects a growing emphasis on operational standardization. Letters of Ignatius, Clement, and Polycarp were circulated and read publicly, establishing consistency in instruction and governance. These texts functioned as practical guides, instructing leaders on procedures for ethical oversight, resource management, dispute mediation, and operational coordination. The circulation of texts ensured that dispersed communities maintained uniformity of practice and adherence to operational norms, bridging the geographic dispersion inherent in the post-Jerusalem early Christian movement. Leadership structures were further stabilized by clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Bishops acted as central authorities, overseeing doctrinal instruction, dispute resolution, and coordination between local assemblies. Elders and deacons executed operational responsibilities, managing instruction, resources, and local governance. Historical documentation demonstrates that hierarchical structures were applied consistently across dispersed communities, confirming operational stability and governance efficacy. Archaeological evidence of domestic assemblies supports textual records, providing secure venues for leadership functions, instruction, and operational management. By the end of this period, early Christian communities had established historically verifiable networks capable of sustaining doctrinal instruction, operational cohesion, and administrative continuity. Leadership hierarchies, domestic assemblies, codified texts, communication networks, economic coordination, conflict resolution mechanisms, and inclusion of Gentile members and women collectively ensured continuity, resilience, and effective governance. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates the historical reality of these operational networks and confirms the organizational maturity achieved by 120 AD.